So my name is Dr. Tazeen Daniels. I go by Tazeen or Taz, and I am super excited to be here with you all. I know that the semester for most of us is under full swing, and so there might be some things in here that you can apply immediately into your classroom practice, and also things that you might think about the next time around. So I was super excited to be invited to talk about a really important topic that many of us have been really pondering around, which is how do we build community in online classrooms? Whether they're online, whether they're in person, hybrid, I think a lot of these strategies kind of transcend the context. And so I'm really looking forward to thinking through the challenges and strategies today. Just a little bit about my background. I hold a PhD in anthropology. And I work full-time as an assistant director at the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching at the University of Michigan, where I've been for about 6 years. And I do a lot of the work over there in educational technology, online teaching, as well as issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so you will notice that that is a foundation to a lot of the things that I'm doing. I don't know how to add on inclusion at the end. I always make that a foundational part of any strategy or practice that I promote. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with you today. So instead of setting up some goals, because we have a very short amount of time together and I don't want to be unreasonable about what we can accomplish, I wanted to start with some of my intentions for our time together. So the first is just to help you connect to the experiences of students and faculty. So who are your students and who are you, and how are we building those bridges that perhaps are not as strong as we want them to be? Second is sharing my own knowledge and experiences. I do come with a wealth of experience in teaching in higher ed, especially online, and in the work as I do as an educational developer. I also want to model best practices for inclusive online teaching. You have to practice what you preach. And so a lot of the things that I do, there might be meta moments to think back like, oh, that was an interesting move Taz made, or I liked how she did a report out, or this breakout question. Steal everything and anything from me and from your colleagues. That's the purpose of our time together today. Next is creating opportunities for reflection and for sharing. I know the reason why many of you are here is because you are super busy and now you have this dedicated 45 minutes to think about your teaching and to really reflect on what's worked and what hasn't and what growth areas you have, but also to leverage the experience and expertise of everyone else on this call. I never come in assuming that I know everything. You know your students and your teaching context better than I ever could because you live that. And so I want you to bring all of those good ideas so that we can brainstorm and grow together. And then finally, and most importantly, I want to acknowledge that we are all doing the best that we can. We are still in the middle of a pandemic. A lot of us are, having to navigate care responsibilities or illnesses or mental health and wellness issues. And those are all things that we don't leave at the door, right? We bring them into our work day in and day out. And they're certainly going to be influencing our experience in the session today. So for me personally, I have a 7-month-old at home, and I know at some point my mom's going to text me to go over there and feed him. So I know for me, I'm definitely doing the best that I can with the lack of sleep I had last night and the responsibilities that I have moving forward. So I want to share that grace and humility with all of you. So this is actually part one of a 2-part session on community building and online courses. The first, which is what we're going to be doing today, is really focusing on the relationship between instructors and students. So you and your learners. In session 2, that's when we're really going to be focused on building community and relationships between our learners. So I know that a number of you had submitted really great questions or challenges that you're grappling with that might not get addressed today. We're going to think about those in the next month's session. So this time we're going to focus on instructor and student relationships. So with the limited time that I have, I do want to kind of ground what I'm going to be talking about today in some theory and in some literature. I'm not going to do a deep dive, but I wanted to at least introduce a concept that some of you may or may not already be familiar with. And that is pedagogies of care. I'm going to ask you to do this just because there's so many of you. Can you just give me like a quick emoji, like a thumbs up if you have heard of pedagogies of care, or if that's something that you've practiced? Okay, a few thumbs up, that's great. So we'll have some experts in the room, or at least this is a term that's familiar to you. Well, I'm going to tell you what it is right now. So Pedagogies of Care is the art, science, and practice of cultivating positive relationships between instructors and students. Sounds good, right? That's something that we all want to strive for. So in particular, and this comes right out of the research, is caring as it relates to teachers occurs when a teacher communicates care by word or action when motivated by a desire to strengthen positive relationships between teacher and students. So it's not enough to just say, oh, I'm a good person, I'm a good teacher, so of course they know I care about them, but it's a deliberate demonstration of care. And caring as it relates to students happens when students identify and understand the caring behaviors from their teacher and attributes them to a concern for their welfare. So in other words, students have to believe you. They have to see and see that demonstration and understand that that comes from a true desire for their health and well-being and success. So chances are we all have some pedagogies of care that we practice. There are also probably some of you who are a little bit skeptical, right? Like, okay, Taz, we showed up, so you're just going to tell us to care about our students and that's it. And there might even be a handful of you that think, well, caring is not really helpful. Like, I need to be rigorous and I have a job to do and I'm overstretched anyway. So why is this important? So I'm going to offer a framework that I think has been really helpful for me and a lot of the instructors I work with to understand how pedagogies of care is different than hand-holding, right, or babying our students. So I want to reframe caring as empowering students. So this framework, it comes from Herzberg's two-factor model back in the 50s. It's still relevant today. This is kind of a riff off of that, is the idea that you want to offer students high expectations along with high support. So think about your classes right now and the kinds of expectations you have for your students. If you offer very low expectations, right, like just show up and you get full points and very low support, you're going to get the issue of apathy. So students who just feel isolated, they have low morale, they're avoiding anything creativity, or maybe they don't even show up. So you can start to think, if that's what's happening in your class, you feel like students are just kind of apathetic and blah, it might be because there's a mismatch there. If you have high support, but low challenge, right? That's when you're really babying them and holding their hands. That's when you're going to have things like low expectations, complacency, kind of they're too comfortable. There's not really pushing to that learning edge. And some students might be frustrated because it's not challenging enough. If you have high challenge and low support, this is equivalent of dropping them in the deep end. This is when you're going to get a lot of anxiety, right? High expectations. They don't really know if they're hitting or missing the mark. There's unproductive competition between students, low morale. Students are afraid of failure, and they're just generally stressed. So this is a symptom of having high challenge and low support. So the quadrant that we want to aim for is this top right quadrant, which is empowerment. So you are setting high expectations for your students. I know you can do this. I expect this level of engagement, this level of performance from you, but I know it's going to be challenging. And I know that you're going to fail sometimes, and that's okay, because here's the support I'm offering you. I'm building that into the structure. And this is really the zone that I want you to think about putting your students in or striving for. High expectations, cooperation, high morale, encouraging experimentation, and having students that are engaged. Give me a thumbs up if that sounds good to you. Awesome. So what I want to do right now is we're going to do some breakouts. We're going to do 2 of these today, and we're going to mix up the groups. And this is what I want you to do. In your rooms, introduce yourselves. I want you to think about your favorite teacher or mentor, right, in your whole life. So hopefully a teacher, but maybe, you know, coach or someone important in your life. And I want you to think about how they demonstrated care for your success and well-being. What did they actually do or say or prove to you that made you really feel like you were cared for? And then second is, how do you as an instructor demonstrate care for your students? Because there might be some of those things that you've learned that you practice. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in the chat, the questions. And then Gary, I'm going to have you go ahead and open up the breakout rooms. And we're going to give you about 6 to 8 minutes to do that. I will give you a couple of warnings. And notice that I said at the bottom, choose one person to take notes and share with the whole group. We'll do a time check to see if we have a chance to hear from a few of you, but if not, at least we'll hear from you in the chat. So go ahead.
All right.
Gary. Yep, we can open it up.
I'll pause the recording.
Flooding back in. Hey folks. Okay. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, if you were your reporter for your room, the person who is supposed to report out, I'm going to ask you to use the raise my hand function in Zoom. So you can find that under reaction, and then the very bottom bar says raise hand. So if I could get a few people do that, and then I will randomly call on just a few of you, just because I'd love to get some voices in the space. So I'm going to start with Greg, because I love that background. It makes me feel good about being a Michigander because it's so beautiful here, right? In picture form. So tell me about your conversation. What are some ways that you all have seen care demonstrated and demonstrate care for your students?
Thank you. So I mean, we all had a pretty common theme, which is just that the simple reaching out to someone in a very direct manner. Um, so as say a faculty community college, it's just like literally approaching somebody and say, hi, how are you? And a lot of times students are actually surprised that you're kind of looking at them and talking to them as another human being. I mean, that was my particular example. Another example was that this particular faculty was just very consistent, even to the point of like giving zeros on quizzes, but then the explanation of, well, I was being consistent, and then let's communicate then. And that was another example. So hopefully I kind of spoke well for the overall sentiment here in our group.
I love that, Greg. So definitely the idea of just feeling seen as a student, right? Out of a sea of students, somebody actually saw you and took the time to say something to you. And also you're kind of putting on this theme of like transparency, that yes, I give you a grade, but that grade isn't who you are. There's an explanation for that grade, and let's have it. Let that be a conversation starter, not a conversation ender.
Right.
Let me go to Sarah Stout. Hi, Sarah. That's all right, Sarah.
I'm sorry, I thought you unmuted me.
Oh, no, that's okay.
That person. I was that. Wow. Sorry.
You don't have that power, unfortunately, Sarah, but you did great. Go ahead.
Darn it. We all had some really great examples of people we worked with before, and we talked about the communication piece, that they were available, they were empathetic, they communicated with us, how important that was to have that dialogue. And I know, we all have different ways that we can do that now, but getting back to people and being reliable in that way is huge. We talked about trying to create cohesive groups, that we try to do that in our classrooms with different tools that we used. In fact, Patricia talked about a what means the most to me moment that she uses in her classrooms. Kevin discussed being available and communicating. I talked about, I brainstorm with my students, what do they think makes a good professor and what makes a good student? And we go back to that many times during the semester. So those are the kinds of things we thought were important.
I love that. I think a theme that's coming up for me as you're speaking is intentionality, right? This idea that it doesn't just happen. You have to create moments and opportunities for that. I'm going to choose one more person, and then we're going to move to the next activity. But I feel like there are a lot of great nuggets in these conversations. So if you could take a moment and in the chat, maybe write down one or two of those practices that you're like, oh, this is good. Like, I'm going to use this. That would be amazing. And then I'm going to call on Tara. So you won't be able to put it in the chat, but you're going to share with us out loud. What were some of the things from your conversation?
Hi. So in our conversation, both the members of my group had a teacher who took the time out of their day, extra time, to put in with a student who needed help. One was a spelling teacher that stayed in at lunchtime, and the other was an algebra teacher who met early in the mornings before school even began. And those, the willingness to be available and be there for students and offer support to a student that really needed the extra support made a difference for them. And for me, I didn't really have anyone stand out, which is kind of sad. I did online school through Western 5 years ago now. and online learning wasn't nearly as interactive as it is now. So I'm glad we have these opportunities to learn and grow so students can make these connections.
I love that, Tara. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that's right. We can learn just as much from what didn't happen to us or poor practices that made us feel like we're not cared for, and really be the change that we want to see in higher ed. Great. So I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen real quick here. And I've done this exercise many times, and I have identified some patterns. Maybe you can see some examples and how they map onto these. Not an exhaustive list, but something to think about. A caring instructor invests time in getting to know you, your goals, and your growth areas, right? They really get to know you. They build a sense of community and belonging in the classroom and in the discipline, especially for those students who are underrepresented or minoritized in their field, really taking the time to make sure that they see themselves as professionals, right, in that work. Provides opportunities to experiment, fail, and improve, right? Yes, I gave you a 0, but that does not indicate who you are or your potential. In fact, this is part of the learning process, normalizing failure as part of learning. Makes you think critically, shifts your paradigm of understanding. I know in each of our disciplines, there are those threshold concepts, right? That once you understand that, your whole world changes. I know, for example, in anthropology, I'm a medical anthropologist. And so when I learned that science is not absolute, but it's actually culturally shaped, that was paradigm shifting for me. There's a culture of science. So there might be some of those paradigm shifting moments, right, that happen, and instructors can create those. They present material that's relatable and relevant, both inside and outside the classroom. They really make you care about the subject matter because they themselves are enthusiastic, and that becomes contagious. And they develop tangible skills and transferable skills like teamwork, communication, technical abilities. And that's not just something that happens by proxy. They say, you're doing this group project, and part of what you're learning is how to work as a team, is how to manage conflict, and I'm going to support you through that. And then finally opens the door to new opportunities like mentorship and research. And I had a chance to be in a pair with Ian, and he was telling me about how his mentor pushed him to go to graduate school to the point where it felt like it was his responsibility, right, to continue that work and to make something of this great potential that he has. So these are things I think that we all hopefully are striving for as we think about becoming and improving our ability to be caring instructors. So, okay, start off on a positive note. If it was Cinchi, we would have all done it already, right? But there are some real challenges to building relationships, especially in the online classroom and especially in February of 2022. So I want to be really realistic about that and name just a sampling of what those are that I've come across. So one is burnout, okay? Both students and instructors are struggling with mental and physical burnout from increased work and decreased resources. And decreased resources being time, energy, attention, right? Emotional resources, all of those things count. And what I found interesting is that students don't realize that their teachers are burnt out, and teachers don't realize that their students are burnt out when they are. And so for me, I think, wow, there's a communication gap there. How can we fix that? Number two is distance. With so many students, especially those of you in big classes, it can be hard to connect with every single one. Especially I heard from you from asynchronous classes where you don't get to quote unquote see them every week, right? Those general traditional kind of feedback mechanisms that, oh yeah, we're connected. They can see that I care about them. They might not be there. So that can feel hard. Isolation, and we actually just heard that from Tara, right? Online environment can make it difficult, right, to build trust and share our struggles with one another, which can lead to isolation. And that's very true, especially for students who only are taking online courses. And then trauma. Right now, students have lost loved ones. They feared for their health, for their safety because of their social identities, right? Their race, their sexual orientation, their gender expression, and they're concerned about graduation. Are they actually going to be able to graduate with all of these challenges in the way? And so these are real challenges, and we are not able to solve all of them, but we need to be able to think more flexibly and tangibly for how we navigate these things. So here are some strategies that I have. If you want to cheat sheet, this is as close as you're going to get to things to think about, because I want to give you some concrete takeaways. So the first thing that I want you to think about is sharing your story. Like I mentioned, it feels to me like there's a big disconnect between students seeing you as just a grader or an evaluator, right? Or like someone who's just punishing them by giving them extra homework. And instead, I want you to humanize yourself. Now, I'm not saying share everything about your life, but there's one thing that I would like to see everyone start doing, which is at the beginning, share the story of how you entered your field and the struggles that you faced. Right? For me, I talk about how I was valedictorian at my high school. And then my first semester, I took chemistry and I failed. I failed my first college chemistry class. And then I talk about how I failed it again the second time I took it because I didn't ask for the support that I needed to do well. And then the third time I took it, I got an A, but I changed my major. And then now, X number of years later, I am literally working with the chemistry department at the University of Michigan, improving teaching so that people like me who got left behind don't get left behind now. So think about that, right? These are the kinds of stories that students never hear from us that can really reshape their fundamental understanding of what it means to be a learner. And it also gets them to start to trust you, right? Because they see that you are more than just a grader and that you see them as more than just, a body or a student ID number. Number two is to do an intake. We need more information about our learners. Who are they? Why are they here? What motivates them? How do they take feedback? What are their life goals? What do they see as their growth areas? What goals do they have for themselves? And so you can do this in terms of a survey, an introduction essay, or even if you're doing this asynchronously, having them post a video or a Flipgrid or a little audio snippet, something to help you learn a little bit more about them. And even just the act of doing that can make them feel seen and gives them that sense of trust, right? Like, oh, this person actually asked to know about me. And that really can help shape your journey with them forward. Give me a quick reaction if you do some type of intake in your classes. Okay, a few of you. So we'll have a chance to think more about what that looks like. Formal office hours or informal check-ins. So providing structured pathways for students to get to know you one-on-one at the beginning of the semester and ways for them to reach out for help when they need it. If you have a small class, I definitely encourage you to think about ways of meeting students, even if it's not one-on-one, in small groups for something informal, if you have the bandwidth. If you have a lot of students, give them that opportunity. Maybe it's not a requirement, but for those students who think office hours is for people who are like not smart or struggling, they don't realize that office hours is actually a way that you get to know your instructor. And then that's how you build a relationship. And then that's how you get really good letters of recommendation and opportunities to do research, right? So realize that there's this hidden curriculum. And for a lot of students who are first generation or international, they might feel really scared to reach out to you. And so you do that reach out first. You normalize building those kinds of positive relationships and not just punitive relationships, right? When you see an email from your professor, you don't want to just assume, uh-oh, I'm in trouble, but like, oh, hey, this is Dr. Daniels. Like, I want to hear what she has to say. Maybe she has an opportunity for me or a resource that I could use. And then informal check-ins, these are things where in class, and I'm sure you've heard of classroom assessment techniques, or CATs as we like to refer to them, which are just moments in class where you can check in with your students. I have a video that I posted on my YouTube, and Kevin and Gary, I can share a link with that afterwards, all about helping instructors prepare to teach during election week. Do you remember what that was like, teaching during election week a couple of years ago? And the idea that like students might not be completely there, but this is also the case where after a big tragedy, a national tragedy happens. And these days it feels like there's a new national tragedy every other week, right? That's coming up. So how is it that you check in with your students? Make sure that they're okay, that they're ready to learn, that, if they need to take a break, that you're able to be flexible with them. So using things like direct messaging and chat, and normalizing the range of emotions by sharing how you're also feeling. Hey, something really big just happened in our country. I'm feeling really anxious and nervous. So I imagine many of you are too, right? Just saying a little bit of that relieves the anxiety and humanizes the experience. And then finally, campus resources. There are so many resources across campus, and also there are not enough resources across campus, right? We know that all institutions are struggling with that, but it's really important for you to be able to familiarize yourself and to be able to discuss that with students on the first day. So it's not just like, oh, you're having a crisis here, let me send you here, but instead normalizing that, hey, throughout the semester, things might happen. Here's the writing center where you can go to get help on writing, and telling them about that before they get a bad grade on their writing assignment, right? Or here's the science learning center, or here's, student wellness services. In case you need to reach out to them, you have the information up front. So normalizing that everyone needs help. So those are some of the strategies just to get you started, to whet your appetite. And I know you do some of these things and I want to hear about them. So in the next breakout, these are the questions, and let me get to the chat. I'm gonna post that there. So what do you share about yourself, personal or professional, with your students, and why? I shared with you that I have a baby and that I'm still nursing, right? That was something. Hopefully that humanized me. And also maybe made you feel like, oh, okay, I can go to the bathroom or take a break, because Taz is already thinking about that. But is there anything you wish you could share about your life? Number two, how do you get to know your students, right? That intake piece. What else would you want to know about them and why? Things like, hey, do you have a weekend job that makes it hard for you to meet on the weekends to do team projects? Or are you living out of state, which makes it hard to do X, Y, and Z with time? Like, there could be a million different things. So what are the things you want to get to know? And then finally, how do you check in with students throughout the semester? So Gary, if you could go ahead, and this is going to be a new room. All right, welcome back. Great conversations. Oh, that was so refreshing for me to hear already such great ideas that are coming out from the room. So I'm going to ask you one more time, if you were your reporter, go ahead and raise your hand, because I'd love to hear from a couple of you before I share my final thoughts for today. Awesome. All right, let's start with Beth. Tell me about your conversation. What are some ways that we get to know our students and each other and check in with them?
So we had a great discussion, lots of energy amongst our group. Everybody shares their struggles with their students, kind of how they got started. And most everybody is using maybe an icebreaker or an introduction on their online course software, kind of modeling it with a post about themselves and engaging students to do the same. And we even had one of the members tell in their face-to-face class they're even just using note cards that the instructor collects and then gets to know the students that way as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Beth. Great ideas. Let's go to Joan. Oh, Joan, you're muted, hon. Sorry about that. Yeah, and if folks have ideas, go ahead and.
There I am.
Yeah, there you go.
There were several of us who collect the information via either email or information sheets or discussions right at the beginning of the course. And many meet one-on-one during the semester as well. Most mentioned a preterm letter where they introduce themselves to the students and also ask students to email back with information, personal information about themselves. Icebreakers were mentioned, random roll calls, and discussion threads were also, I think that's most of it.
Yeah, I think we're starting to kind of spill into what we're going to do next session, which is all about building community between students. But what I'm hearing from you, and I'll just extrapolate, is that when you are asking students to communicate, you want to model what that communication looks like, right? If you want students to respond to each other with empathy and care and enthusiasm, you need your responses on those threads and on those videos to kind of emulate those things as well. It doesn't work every time, but it definitely tips the scales in your favor for the kind of communication relationships you want. Chrissy, we'll end with you. What are some of the ideas that your group came up with?
So we had such good discussions that we only got through question one, but that's okay. So we all said that we had some online instructors and some in person, but in general, we tend to reveal information about ourselves, whether it's through a video or, in person. And we mentioned hobbies, especially we had a discussion about mentioning hobbies that are kind of off the wall that you wouldn't think. Like I always tell my students that I'm a gamer, and everyone's like, you're a gamer? What? You're an instructor. You can't do that. So it's just kind of a way to connect with them in an unexpected way. And also a couple of our instructors had mentioned that they'll talk about some personal details, like if they suffer loss, like one of our instructors discussed, she lost her family pet, and another instructor discussed kind of the thing that we had mentioned before with, oh, I didn't do so well in this particular class, or I failed this, and just kind of striking the balance between we're using this as a connecting tool as opposed to I'm just going to tell you all my personal information. It's about me. So, and that has really helped our students feel safer, I guess, that, they're not the only one who goes through these things, and that, we're here for them too.
I love that. Yeah, it's not just about oversharing or trying to get someone to like you, but it's about modeling and building a foundation of trust that hopefully your students start to do with each other as well. I love that. Since we're already out of time, let's hop to my final thoughts and recognize that the conversation is yet to be continued. So a few things. One, I appreciate you all being here and caring so much about this, but I really encourage you to temper your expectations about what's possible. Just like every class or teacher didn't change your life, right? You may not be able to meet the unreasonable expectation that you connect with every single student in the same kind of deep and meaningful way. So think quality over quantity, and also think about ways that you can do so without stretching yourself too thin. Next point, don't overstretch yourself. Being available 24/7 to every student is not sustainable. Being flexible is important, but so is setting boundaries to maintain your own mental health. The one thing that I would say is that if you are struggling or you feel like your students' needs are outweighing your resources, I think it's about being transparent and upfront. Here's when I will be available. Here are the appropriate pathways. For example, I have a friend who has told me the other day she was teaching until 5 o'clock. She told the students I have a hard stop because I have to go pick up my child from childcare, but there are a number of students that wanted to stay late and talk to her. So she had to do the hard work of saying, nope, I already set this boundary. I'm more than happy to have you email me and schedule an appointment as soon as I'm available. If it's an emergency, then I need you to go through this other pathway, which is email me directly and I'll check that tonight. So I think it's important to remember that we cannot give 100% of ourselves. You have to fill your own cup first. And then finally, like a lot of you already said, is modeling generosity and vulnerability. So if you demonstrate care for your students, they're more likely to meet you with that same care and grace, especially if you're struggling or you make a mistake. And I cannot emphasize this enough. So many colleagues I know were beating themselves up because their grading was late, or they owed their students something, they couldn't get it to them, and they just felt like, oh, I'm failing as a teacher, especially when students were getting upset about it. But then I had to remind them, no, you're a human being. Things happen. Do you show them flexibility? Okay, well, then you can ask them for some flexibility if you're transparent about what your intentions are and how you're going to do better. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop the share. And I'm going to ask you just in this last second here, if there's any other strategies that you have around building relationships. I'm going to ask you to, you can put them in the chat if you have a minute or two, but share them across this group, share them with colleagues, things that you took away from today. And as I mentioned before, I am on Twitter. So if there are things that you took screenshots of or ideas to share, please follow me on Twitter and tag me in any of those pearls of wisdom, because I'd love to keep the conversation going. And stay tuned for next time when we'll talk about student-to-student interactions. So Gary, with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Taz. Kevin, you had a few words.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Dr. Daniels for this first session. And as she said, session number 2 coming up February 24th. I don't know about all of you, but this session just flew by. It was too fast. Not that you were talking too fast, but like just so much more that we can talk about. So really looking forward to workshop number 2. In the meantime, I do want to bring up something that we've talked about as an executive group is having a Twitter chat in between. So to go along the lines of what Dr. Daniels was saying about Twitter, stay tuned. I'm going to be emailing everybody sometime soon that's here in this session, and hoping to next week sometime on an evening have a Twitter chat to kind of circle back and talk a little bit more about what was covered today, and maybe what your thoughts are and ideas that have come up since then, and what you can do in your classroom. So stay tuned for that. So that's all I have.
Thanks, everybody. I'll stop the recording and we will see you next time.